Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. Um, I had something that I wanted to talk about just real quick. Someone was saying that I was proclaiming myself to be a minister and preaching and that I was a preacher. No, I'm not trying to claim that at all. Um, to be perfectly honest, the reason I started doing this is for a few reasons. One is I am truly a firm believer in the power of prayer. I'm a firm believer that with prayer, things can be answered. Our problems can be answered, and issues that we're dealing with in the power of prayer, God will answer our prayers. And there's so many people that, especially online, that are preaching that this doomsday and we're facing end times, and that could very well be true. However, my thought is, how do I explain this? My thought is nothing is impossible. Things can still be accomplished through prayer. Nothing is it's never too late. And as a country, a handful of people can't change this country through prayer. That has to be done as a collective to do it. We all have to believe in what we're praying about and have faith that God is going to answer our prayers. And I just want to clear that up real quick. I'm sorry. Um, but I'm not out there trying to claim that I'm a preacher. I just wanted to sincerely tell people that there is faith, there is hope, but people have to believe that. Let's get started here. Sorry, I got off on that tangent and I do apologize. I have a Bible verse for us today. This one is from Mark 11:24, and it reads, "Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours." That's a very, very strong message. You can't just pray for something. You have to pray it and believe that your prayers are going to be answered. I firmly believe that that is true. In the last video that I did, I had mentioned that I wanted to talk about the power of prayer and how it had changed people's lives. There was a number of different stories that I had. Then I remembered this one gentleman, and I thought, instead of telling about a number of different people that had experiences with the power of prayer, which I know we've all had experiences with the power of prayer, I wanted to speak about this one gentleman for a little bit. George Mueller was his name. And what's interesting is he was not always a person of such great faith and good character. As a young boy growing up in Germany in the early 1800s, he was often caught stealing money from his own father. Even as a teenager, he would sneak out of hotels without paying for his room. One time, he was caught by the police and even put in jail. As a college student, George loved going to the bars, drinking, gambling, and being the life of the party. He also loved making fun of people, especially Christians. Kind of funny, though, how God works in people's lives. One day, a friend invited George to go to an off-campus Bible study. He went, only because he wanted to be able to make fun of the Christians later. But to his surprise, he really liked the Bible study. For the first time, he saw people who really knew and really loved God. And he started attending each and every evening. Before a week was up, he started kneeling by his bed and would ask God for his forgiveness of all of his sins, for all the horrible things that he had done, for all the ways that he had ridiculed and made fun of people. His friends started seeing a change in him immediately. He no longer went to the bars or made fun of people. And he spent a lot of time then reading the Bible and talking about God and going to church. Soon he found that his friends did not want to be around him anymore. That is, his old friends. Because when he started changing, they didn't fit into that old group anymore. So one day, George went to his father and told his father that he had decided to become a missionary. Well, now his father was very upset with him. He wanted George to have a very high-paying job and not be some sort of poor missionary. He told George that he would not give him any more money or help support his schooling. Well, George didn't know what he would do, but George started talking to God because he wanted to continue to stay in school at college. He didn't know where his support would come from, but the one person that he could count on and he could turn to that he felt was God. George went back to college without knowing how he was going to pay for his tuition. He did something that he thought was a bit silly for a grown man to do. He got on his knees and asked God to provide for him. To his surprise, an hour later, a professor knocked on his door. He offered George a paid tutoring job. George was amazed. This was the beginning of George Mueller's dependence on God. After finishing college, George was ready to become a missionary, and he went to London, England. But there was one problem. Germany required all healthy men to serve at least 1 year in the army. George wanted to get to his mission as quick as possible. However, he became very sick. His illness was so serious that he almost died. It also made him unable to serve in the army. He was now free to go to England as a missionary. George became then a pastor of a small church in England. The church wanted to pay him a good salary from the money it received from renting pews. Back then, what they would do is the pews that was in the front part of the church would be rented out to the wealthy. And the poor members had to sit in the cheap seats in the back part of the church. George told them that had to stop if they wanted him to be their pastor. Even so, he did not allow, in order to do that, he said, "Don't pay me a salary." George trusted God to meet all of his needs, and God did. George and his family never missed a meal and were always able to pay their rent, even without George having a salary, because George felt no one should have to come into a church and pay to rent a pew in order to hear a sermon. George began to sense, however, that God had something else for him to do. Didn't know what. You ever had that feeling that maybe God wanted you to do something else? You just didn't know what. Each day as George walked the streets, he saw children everywhere who had no mom or dad. They lived out on the streets or in state-run poorhouses. And they were treated so badly. George felt God calling him to open up an orphanage to take care of these children. George didn't have the money to do this, but he knew this is what God wanted him to do. So George prayed, asking God to provide a building, people to oversee it, furniture, and money for food and clothing. God answered his prayers. The needs of the orphans were met each day. Sometimes a wealthy person would send a large amount of money. Even sometimes a child would give a small amount that they had received from gifts or doing chores. Many times food, supplies, or money came at the last minute. But God always provided without George having to tell anyone else about his needs. He just prayed and waited on God to provide for him. One morning, in fact, the children were all dressed and ready to go to school. This happened a number of times. But there was no food for them to eat. There was no food at all, the house mother of the orphanage informed George. George told her, take the 300 children that was in the orphanage into the dining room and set them at the tables. She informed him again, there's no food. You don't understand. There's no food. He thanked God for the food that he knew he would be getting, and George waited. George knew that God would provide food for the children, as he had always done. Within minutes, a baker knocked on the door. Mr. Mueller, he said, last night, for some reason, I just could not sleep. Somehow, I knew that you needed bread this morning. I got up and I baked 3 extra batches for you. I will bring it in right now. Soon, there was another knock at the door. It was the milkman. His cart had broken down in front of the orphanage. The milk would spoil by the time the wheel was fixed. He asked George if he could use some free milk. George smiled at the milkman, and the milkman brought in 10 large cans of milk. It was just enough for the 300 children. Today, there are tens of thousands of children living in the orphanage over the years. And there's 117 separate orphanage that had started from George's first belief. And as each child would get old enough to leave the orphanage, George would pray with him and put a Bible in his right hand and a coin in his left hand. And he would explain to the young person that if he held on to what was in his right hand, God would always make sure that something was in his left hand as well. So after 165 years now, since the first orphanage was open, his vision still continues today as Christians around the world are still being inspired by his faith to depend on God to provide him and the children for what they needed. That's one of the strongest stories that I know of pure faith, because that wasn't just a one-time occurrence. with George Mueller. It went on, well, almost since his college time, throughout his entire life. And he would pass that on to the children. And people could, even around him, could see his strong faith that he had. I know that may not be extremely convincing, but if you've never read the book about George Mueller, I would highly suggest you might want to do that. It's very, very, very inspirational. If you get the opportunity, please read that. I hope this touched you in a little bit of a way, and hope you all have a blessed day. Bye-bye for now.